During a time when the influential figures like Ray Dalio are sounding alarms of a broken financial system headed towards complete chaos, I'm reminded of a few words by the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, who intuited a certain truth about our universe. In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order. And it's interesting that he said this because his model of the psyche incorporated the presence of archetypes, which at the most reductionistic level are basically a pattern of behavior. In Jung's models of the psyche, archetypes appear within the collective unconscious as patterns of behavior at the group level, and these archetypes also influence patterns of behavior within the personal unconscious, in many cases forming complexes that serve as a backbone for patterns related to emotions, memories, drives, and so forth, which then go on to manifest within our consciousness as functions primarily related to the ego. So Jung observed these patterns of behavior at the collective or group level, and his synthesis of this led him to describe archetypes as universal archaic patterns and images that derive from the collective unconscious and are the psychic counterpart of instinct. So he found that archetypes, like the shadow, that part of ourself of which we are completely unaware, and the anima animus, the contrasexual parts of our personalities. So in men it would be the unconscious feminine side, and in women it would be the unconscious masculine side. And also the wise old man or the wise old woman, such as a sage or a guru type figure, or a primordial mother slash priestess type of archetype, essentially a supraordinate or a transpersonal version of the father and the mother, are present within everyone. And he found that these patterns repeat throughout culture, mythology, religion, art, and dreams, and also manifest individually within each person through their behavior and interactions with the world. Subsequently, he observed a process known as individuation, through which these archetypal patterns of behavior, which are ordinarily projected outwards into the world, because the basis for understanding ourselves is in reference to the world, are brought into one's awareness and integrated into consciousness so as to promote the emergence of an archetype known as the self, which he described as the process by which every living thing becomes what it was destined to become, kind of like reaching full potential. So for Jung, this symbolized union of the conscious and unconscious, or wholeness within the psyche. And in addition to founding analytical psychology and treating patients as a psychiatrist, Jung was also an artist, and he found repeating patterns and images through various times and cultures and religions, with a thematic element of a dot in the middle surrounded by a circle, where the dot symbolized the ego and the circle represented the self, which he described as an encompassing whole which acts as a container. And he discovered this trend in the form of mandalas. So he found these mandalas in Hinduism, Buddhism, Mesoamerican civilizations such as the Mayans, as well as in Persian art, and also in Christianity. And of course, these are but a few examples, and many more can be found in his Red Book. And we also actually find them in contemporary fine art, such as the Westworld Maze. Inevitably then, the question arises, what is the significance of these patterns? And that's kind of what Jung explored with one of the pioneers of quantum physics, Wolfgang Pauli. And they discussed concepts such as synchronicity, which, without being too pedantic, can be understood as a meaningful coincidence. And because meaning is subjective, I'll give you an example in my life. A couple of years ago, I was writing about the concept of limbic resonance, and a flurry of ideas just flowed into my mind after I listened to a podcast around that time with Joe Rogan and Elon Musk, where they were also discussing limbic resonance. It was a strange coincidence, and it was meaningful because it triggered that kind of response in my psyche. Furthermore, this summer, my graduation from residency in psychiatry will coincide with the next Bitcoin halving. So that's why it's a meaningful coincidence, which can be contrasted with, for example, if you're having conversations with your friends and somehow when you pull out your phone, an advertisement related to that topic comes up. I mean, that's kind of more, unless it's, of course, it's meaningful to you, then it's synchronicity. Otherwise, it wouldn't be. So anyways, they discuss these ideas in the context of breakthroughs in physics, such as the discovery of the wave-particle duality, which was interpreted as evidence to support the notion that psyche and matter are connected along the electromagnetic spectrum, particularly through the archetypes in the collective unconscious that were thought to be the counterpart of instinct, physiological instinct. And this led them to formulate the hypothesis that consciousness may actually be an emergent phenomena of these properties and connections. And these insights led them further to develop a formulation of the psyche as a self-equilibrating or regulating system that maintains itself in equilibrium as the body does, such that only when all of the interactive components of the psyche, including tensions between the opposite, come to equilibrium with each other, does the archetypal self emerge. And so the understanding that the equilibrium between instinct and psyche and matter lie along a continuum to essentially promote consciousness led them to develop a model of the world called the unus mundus, the one world. Sorry, I meant instinct and archetype, psyche and matter. And during that time, in the first half of the 20th century, these ideas were relegated to the realm of parapsychology, or the study of alleged phenomena such as ESP, extrasensory perception, and telepathy, because there was really no way to demonstrate any connection between these patterns, other than the subjective experience in the form of synchronicity. But now we have tools to study these patterns far more effectively. Patterns such as this one, which reflects the market price of Bitcoin on the logarithmic scale. And this archetype, this behavior, is driven by the activity of participants on a network that is decentralized and distributed. Hence, we have a pattern of behavior, or the Bitcoin archetype, driven by consensus at unprecedented scale, as the folks at A16Z have described. In contrast, the legacy financial market, comprised of exchange-traded funds, ETFs like the S&P 500, which, as the name indicates, is a measure of the 500 largest companies listed on stock exchanges, such as Amazon and Google, are much more centralized, because it's primarily driven by those large nodes, essentially, which have a lot of value. Furthermore, we've come to learn that there appears to be a pattern that repeats every so often with Bitcoin, also known as a fractal. Not identical to, but very much like the side of a snowflake and the Mandelbrot set. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, and this is an example of that. And in this case, in the case of Bitcoin, the pattern repeats every 4 years, because every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin released into circulation is cut in half, which helps explain why the value of Bitcoin increases every 4 years. Because its value is likely rooted in scarcity. In fact, mathematically, the price of Bitcoin tightly hugs this black line, which is the price of Bitcoin calculated using the stock-to-flow model, which essentially models scarcity. And this is done by taking the stock, which is the entirety of a substance in existence, and comparing it with the flow, which is the amount that can be produced or acquired over some specified interval of time. So the ratio of these two quantities is called the S/F ratio, and it turns out that materials with a high stock-to-flow ratio, or those things that cannot be easily obtained, no matter how hard we try, irrespective of the resources we direct towards its acquisition, only a limited amount can be procured, and essentially those are the things that have a very low flow. Some interesting examples of these valuations can be found in this table, which is taken straight from Plan B's Medium article, where we can see that gold has one of the highest S/F ratios, a very low flow and a very high stock. In fact, this is kind of what makes this a very solid method of assessing the soundness or the hardness of money, as we've come to model the Bitcoin as also using this model, which right now has a S/F ratio of 25, higher than silver's but still lesser than gold. And the interesting thing is that every 4 years this ratio goes up because the amount of Bitcoin circulated is cut in half. So this becomes really meaningful when we take the market value of Bitcoin and compare it with this correlation, because the correlation we get is 0.95, nearly 95% correlation. And one way to interpret this is that there is a 95% probability that the S/F Bitcoin price and the market value of the Bitcoin price are related to each other, meaning that it is probably not a coincidence, and the market value of Bitcoin is likely headed towards the $50,000 to $100,000 range. And these are all fascinating developments, and I would recommend those interested further to check out Plan B's article, as well as the Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean Ammous. But one inherent limitation here is that this is just one model. How do we know that this correlation is not spurious, or simply coincidental? Let's take the case of coffee, for example, which has been thought to contribute to lung cancer. But how do we know for sure? Because after all, it is confounded by smoking, as those who smoke also often drink coffee. So that's how we know it is the smoking of the tobacco that causes lung cancer. So fundamentally, we're trying to get to the question of correlation versus causality. It turns out there's a strong chance that there exists a much deeper underlying relationship between the price of Bitcoin and the one calculated using the S2F model, because the two have been found to be co-integrated, as Nick Fraudstra and Plan B have pointed out, which means that even the differences between the market and the S2F calculated Bitcoin values appear to follow a pattern, and are found to be not so different from cycle to cycle. And the analogy of a rubber band has been used to describe how the market value deviates sharply from the calculated value, only to snap back and return to this black line, or the S2F calculated value. And this was discussed between Plan B and Stefan Livera on his podcast. A very good one. I would definitely recommend that. Furthermore, this is exactly kind of what's meant by co-integration, that the differences in the two values are stationary, and it can be visualized in this graph right here, taken from GitHub, where the fitted values, the differences, are not moving, and the price of Bitcoin snaps up like a rubber band and fluctuates back towards the model. So mathematically now, we have strong indicators that there's probably something more universal going on. But what? The way we make sense of the world and data like this is by developing narratives and stories, as the Game of Thrones series finale indelibly taught us all. So taking the hint then, we can see how a few days before disappearing from the internet, Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin, sent a message where he thought of Bitcoin as a pretty boring gray metal. It's not a good conductor of anything, devoid of any intrinsic properties, and just overall kind of useless, except that it is as scarce as gold, and it can be transported over a communications channel. And this is why it has been described as digital gold. I often find myself wondering about the kinds of ideas that would have been shared in between Jung, who was another expert on gold, and Nakamoto, the digital alchemist. And then I'm reminded that they are already in conversation collectively through us. Because Jung also wrote about psychology in relation to alchemy, or the chemical synthesis of gold, that has been studied for centuries throughout the world in various forms, such as the Kimia-i Sa'adat from 11th century Persia, and the Aurora Consurgence from 15th century, what is present-day Switzerland. And also, the Illuminati believed in this, which I had no clue about, but apparently this phrase right here means that everything is connected. And found to be recurring throughout these studies of alchemy was the symbol of the Ouroboros, the snake or the dragon that is shown to be eating its own tail, often shown to symbolize the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And so Jung connected the dots, no pun intended, and saw the mandala as a universal symbol of union and wholeness everywhere that transcended space and time. And these insights led him to realize that what he called the pre-scientific human could not differentiate the subjective from the objective, which meant that the alchemists that he studied, within their minds, their ego essentially projected everything that was going on inside out into the world, such that everything that they were perceiving was actually a mirror or a reflection of their own psyche, so that ultimately the process of alchemy was understood symbolically through the Ouroboros, which again represents transmutation or transformation. And because the alchemists were unaware of these internal mental processes, they were thought to be projecting their unconscious onto this thing known as the prima materia, the primary material with which the process of alchemy began. And the study of alchemy has revealed at least 4 important stages, of which the first is something called the nigredo, the darkening or blackening of the primary material, which again, being a projection of the mind, reflected the unconscious process of the alchemist going through hard times, as if almost a depression had set in. And this was psychologically perceived as a kind of disillusionment, because the first stage initiates the process of differentiating the subjective from the objective. And this is then followed by the albedo, or the whitening, which represents a transition from subjectively experiencing a descent into the unconscious towards a kind of illumination from above. And the third stage of alchemy is called the citrinitas, observed as a yellowing of the primary material, often used to represent the dawning of a solar light or a kind of divinity. And the process of alchemy concludes with the rubedo, or the reddening of the material, representing integration of opposites, their transcendence, and essentially an emergence out of an undifferentiated unconscious, symbolized by the phoenix, which rises from the ashes of destruction to embody a rebirth or a transformation. So the completion of this four-stage process led to the acquisition of the lapis saphorum, or the philosopher's stone, the legendary material capable of converting base into gold, also known as the elixir of life in some cultures. So Jung, returning to his model of the psyche, recognized that this process might hold the key to understanding the psychology of transformation, because again, this was in reality just a projection of the unconscious. So he compared it to the process of individuation, where the first stage of alchemy, nigredo, corresponded with the subjective experience of confronting one's archetypal shadow. And if a person can integrate that into his or her consciousness, then the albedo represents the recognition of the anima animus, or the contrasexual aspects of one's psyche, which, if integrated into one's being, is followed by the awareness of the wise old man and woman archetype that corresponds with the third stage of alchemy. And once this archetype is integrated, the final stage culminates with the emergence of the archetypal self. So Jung talked about ego projections and cautioned that the bigger the ego, the more likely the case that this is true, that it is never I who must change, but always the other fellow. And he also remarked that until the unconscious is made conscious, it'll rule over you. And this is why confrontation with the shadow was the first step in this process. It has also led other thinkers like Hermann Hesse to make similar remarks about the shadow and the unconscious within, that if you hate somebody else, it's likely something within you that's causing that to happen. And therefore, it is only when the projections are retracted does individuation ensue, which Jung described as divesting oneself of false wrappings. And that is one meaningful way to interpret the symbolism of the Ouroboros, the destruction or wounding of one's ego in order to initiate a transformation and the rebirth of a more unified whole, which is what the alchemists interpreted as gold. It's important to remind ourselves at this point that these insights were rooted in both classical and quantum physics, and consequently they are potentially applicable to a variety of complex dynamic systems, such as the psyche, the brain, the unus mundus, the Umwelt, the universe, and the economy. So then if we are to apply this model to the economy, the central banks represent quote-unquote the ego. We can see a similar narrative of the alchemical process playing out over the past decade or so, beginning with the financial crisis of 2008, when the central banks decided to engage in quantitative easing, also known as printing money, because the total money in circulation multiplied by nearly a factor of fivefold from $800 billion to $4 trillion US dollars. I think it actually went a bit above that. And from one perspective, this can be conceptualized as exertion of the central authority on the macro global economy, which had unintended or perhaps intended effects on the value of the US dollar. Because in contrast to the sound or the hard money that is represented by precious metals like gold and now Bitcoin with a high S/F ratio, these actions led to the opposite effect of recklessly increasing the flow of the US dollar to lower the S/F ratio, promoting the handout of easy money to the perpetrators of the crisis, meaning the scarcity value of the US dollar diluted or decreased in value by a factor of 4 to 5, thus begging the question, does 1 US dollar really equal 1 US dollar? Well, like every other fiat or government-backed currency, the purchasing power of the US dollar has been dropping relentlessly for quite some time now. I believe 98% is the number, so you can be the judge of that. But it's important to note that this was very likely the impetus for the Bitcoin network to go live, as designated by Satoshi's original message in the Bitcoin Genesis block. The Times, January 3rd, 2009, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. And of the many things Bitcoin has come to represent, such as digital gold, it is also trust put into computer code by mathematics. Hence the saying, verus in numeris, strength in numbers, because there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin, and nobody can steal your wealth by inflating it away, which is kind of what the banking system has been doing for quite some time now. Indeed, the monopolistic control of central banks on the creation of money can be conceptualized as a 51% attack on the free market. So is the market really free? Much like the ego that must be disillusioned or wounded on a personal level from one perspective, the 2008 financial crisis can be thought of as a collective negredo, or the first stage of alchemy, as people began to realize that Keynesian economics may not be the best way to model our economy. Essentially, it was a confrontation of the collective shadow. And this first step is understood as a decomposition process, which was essentially what happened to the market, as the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted in value by 54% during this crisis. And this chaos was followed by the albedo, understood as a purification process, bringing light and clarity to the primary material by washing away impurities, which symbolically could represent the consistent flow and accrual of value into the Bitcoin network, making it the best performing asset class over the past decade. And this value essentially can be thought of as washing away of the impurities from the legacy financial market into this one. The third stage of alchemy, Synchronicity, is occasionally also described as a yellow death, reflecting the transformation of the pure spirit embodied by the albedo into a revelatory solar light emblematic of a kind of divinity that endows a creative spirit and true knowledge onto a person. And that's what happened after the initial coin offering, or the ICO mania of 2017. The bullshit of the bull market was followed by a bear market that did indeed bear fruit, as developer focus shifted towards understanding this innovation of peer-to-peer money in the form of distributed ledger technology, and building the infrastructure to help bank the unbanked. So has the implosion of money occurred yet, thus completing the final stage of alchemy? Well, the way it goes is gradually and then suddenly, as this post by Parker Lewis denotes. And in my humble opinion, it's really only a matter of time till the so-called flippening occurs, because man created fiat money, and man has now essentially destroyed it by inflating its value, and more fundamentally, violating the trust of the people. And out of the ashes of this disorder has risen the phoenix that is Bitcoin and other digital assets or cryptocurrencies. As Pomp and the rest of the community now say, long Bitcoin, short the bankers. I do like this saying a lot because of the atrocities and the crimes committed by these financial institutions that essentially went unpunished. But a more balanced solution, I think, does lie in digitizing the fiat US dollar and making transactions public, just like they are on the publicly distributed ledger that is the Bitcoin blockchain. And this would really be a solid step towards reestablishing trust that was so wrongfully violated by the authority figures in positions of power. In addition to the mathematical relationship and the narratives that we've discussed so far, we also have the symbolic meaning of the number 4 that transcends space and time. From the microscopic structure of DNA with 4 base pairs and the 4 stages of cell division, to the macroscopic bioarchitecture of the heart, the 4 chambers of the heart, as well as the 4 lobes of the brain. We also see other examples, such as the four suits in a deck of cards, archetypal stories like the Fantastic Four, the four masculine archetypes, such as the king, warrior, magician, lover, and of course the four stages of alchemy that have been derived in many ways from the four main elements: water, fire, earth, and wind. We further see it transcend through time in the form of the ever-repeating four seasons and the four yugas or ages described in Hindu mythology, which might ring a bell if you've seen Sacred Games on Netflix. Some scholars note that we're currently in the Kali Yuga right now, and that seems accurate since we are amid chaos and discord, as much of the world is concerned with materialistic possessions, while the financial world is always eagerly awaiting higher numbers in the next quarterly earnings report. So could the creation of Bitcoin foreshadow a transition to the Satyug or the Golden Age? Well, there's certainly a sense of wokeness these days in the air. And of course, these tropes resonate with our 4-year election cycles and the cyclicality of the Bitcoin archetype. Circling back to the mandalas, we can find that the symbolism of the quaternity, which Jung described as an expression of wholeness, also permeates through space and time. He further elaborated about mandalas that they were actually cryptograms concerning the state of the self, which are essentially, in a way, you can think of them as compression algorithms for information. And finally, we also find the symbolism of the quaternity in the prisoner's dilemma, often used to depict the Nash equilibrium, which in game theory represents the outcome when each player can no longer gain anything by changing their own strategy. And in a way, this has essentially been programmed into the computer code of Bitcoin. So now, we have numbers to show somewhat a causal relationship, a story or a narrative to make sense of what's happening, and the meaning of the number 4, which symbolically represents wholeness, completion, or union. And indeed, all roads do appear to converge on Bitcoin, which has its roots in finite scarcity. So in discussing the Bitcoin archetype, have we in turn discovered a scarcity archetype? It certainly seems so. But the question still remains, how do we know that we're not just trying to make something out of nothing by forcing connections? Well, turns out the Illuminati might have been onto something because everything is indeed connected. Statistically, it's called a causal relationship, and this has been found in the context of a mathematical formulation known as the free energy principle. And here is the most cited neuroscientist and psychiatrist in the world, Carl Friston, explaining just that. How our brains try to model this causal or connected architecture of the world.
That can be unpacked at many, many different levels, and it has provided a very useful framework within which to understand how that free energy principle is complied with by the biology and the anatomy and the physiology of the brain. What it tells you is that the anatomy of any system has to contain with it a model of the environment in which that system is immersed. Which means that if we live in a world that has some deep hierarchical structure in which there is action at a distance, for example, so that the colour of objects around me is determined by the incident light as it comes almost instantaneously to my eye, or a falling body is caused by gravity, then my brain must recapitulate that causal structure. And of course it does. The very fact we have nerve cells with long, slender connections connecting each other at a distance speaks exactly to the fact that the causal architectures of the world that we inhabit have this action at a distance and this sparse connectivity. Furthermore, the hierarchical structure of the world is recapitulated in the neuronal structures that constitute the hierarchies of the connectome or the hierarchical disposition of functionally specialized brain areas. If the brain is truly a statistical model of the world it inhabits, can we understand some fundamentals of brain organization?
The fundamental premises of the principle is that just like our brain statistically models the world also models us. The relationship is a two-way street, meaning that the brain, being the most sophisticated distributed computing system we know of, has already solved the Byzantine general's problem. And now, the world is modeling that through the invention of distributed ledger technology. of which the first instance was Bitcoin. Understanding DLT necessitates the adoption of systems-level thinking and interdisciplinary perspectives. And this layout by Artie Paul from a couple of years ago does a good job at depicting that, because the technology is driving innovation and breakthroughs in economics, politics, game theory, cryptography, computer science, investing, trading, and now also neuroscience. And in order to see this, we must start somewhere, so let's take a quick look by answering the fundamental question of what exactly is money. It's generally agreed that money serves three fundamental functions. Money is used for measurement of value that allows for comparison, such as the price of a gallon of gas, so it's a unit of account. Money also is an intermediary for exchanging value to circumvent limitations of barter, such as the coincidence of wants, making it a medium of exchange. And perhaps most importantly, money must retain its purchasing power and function as a store of value. We observe a similar phenomena of money in the brain in the form of neurotransmitters, chemicals such as dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, and so forth, which, after being released and binding to a receptor from the neuron, function to change the membrane potential by some quantifiable amount of millivolts. And when many neurotransmitters bind and push the potential past a certain threshold, they can depolarize the neuron and trigger it to fire. In doing so, the neurotransmitters also function as a medium of exchange to convert chemical energy into electricity, and back and forth it goes. And finally, after the neurotransmitter has done its job, sometimes it is degraded, but most commonly it is reabsorbed for later use, making it a store of value. Furthermore, because there is no middleman facilitating these transactions, the exchange of neurotransmitters is trustless. And because this happens amongst 86 billion neurons, there is consensus at scale. And there are many implications as a result of these insights, some of which were discussed and introduced in my residency Grand Rounds presentation in this past year, in December of 2019, titled The Economy of Neurotransmitters, Neural Networks, and Neuromodulation. And of course, I definitely want to give a shout out and thanks to my mentor, Dr. Gregory Marr, who helped cultivate these ideas. And I also want to clarify that the health system does not bear any responsibility or liability here. Though I would like to point out that Henry Ford, the man himself, was an inspiration, because he said this over almost nearly a century ago now, that it is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. Well, this revolution began over a decade ago, and if you've been paying attention this far, then it's likely that your brain has expended a noticeable amount of dopamine and other neurotransmitters in the prefrontal cortex and its associated circuitry. There is significant overlap between this and the way in which basic attention token is distributed on the Ethereum blockchain, where the exchange of Ethereum between computers leads to the creation of gas that powers the smart or digital contract, which houses the 300 million basic attention token dedicated towards the user growth pool stored for distribution anytime a person joins the network and contributes their attention to the ecosystem. And in this way, consensus is established and the middleman is disintermediated. I can't replenish your neurotransmitters, but what would help right now is probably hydrating yourself, going for a 5 to 10 minute brisk walk. That should get some blood flow going back to your brain. And at the same time, please do help yourself by downloading the Brave browser, which rewards you with basic attention token for your attention. And feel free to use these referral links or Google it to download the browser. And also check out my YouTube channel with the tipping banner, and send some bat my way if you found that this video added value to your life. In the next videos, we'll take a look at other models of the psyche by studying distributed ledger technology in the brain to help us understand hierarchical neural networks, which are kind of like layers on the blockchain, layer 0, layer 1, layer 2, and so forth. And because the mind itself is a metaphor, it's best understood using other metaphors. So we'll see how UTXOs and 51% attacks and trustless exchanges and so forth are, share common features with the mind and the way the brain functions. And my hope is that at the end of this, we can come to consensus on real-world use cases for distributed ledger technology by essentially modeling the brain. So for example, how would you like to earn money for sleeping soundly at night? Feel free to check out Aladdin Dreamer to get an idea of where this may head. And if you're interested in building a better world and find that these values align with yours, then feel free to send value my way at these Web3 addresses. I want to help drive widespread adoption of cryptocurrency, so I accept essentially all formats. And definitely do check out Unstoppable Domains. This is a referral link, but of course you can go there and try it out yourself. I think this definitely, they're doing a fantastic job there of decentralizing the web. And I'm also available on Twitter. My crypto Twitter account is @JackTapper. Professional Twitter is this. And finally, if you're interested in exploring your own understanding of these ideas further, whether they are related to crypto, money, psychology, the universe, or whatever it may be that's bubbling up in your mind now, I invite you to visit the Jungian Society for Scholarly Studies, which is an amazing group of people who welcome interdisciplinary thought and have a much needed refreshing perspective on the world. Thank you for your attention.